Hi, in just a few minutes, I quickly want to introduce you to the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke in the New Testament is the third of four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And just to give you a little sense of where the experts are with figuring out about this book, who, where, when, and so forth, we might first say that most of the Gospel of Mark, the second Gospel, is also in Luke. Mark was neglected for much of church history because something like all but 30-some verses of it are in either Matthew or Luke. So why do you need Mark as a kind of Reader's Digest, version when you have Matthew and Luke? In the late 1800s, however, some very careful comparisons came to the conclusion that maybe Mark might actually be the earliest of the three, and that Matthew and Luke might actually have used Mark as a source to form kind of the skeleton of their Gospels. And so then everybody was interested in Mark all of a sudden in the late 1800s. But this isn't a video about Mark, it's a video about Luke. But most of Mark is indeed in Luke. Now this probably dates Luke, and Luke is the first volume of two volumes, Luke Acts. They're a kind of history, as it were, of the beginnings of Christianity, of the Christian movement. And so we might say that they're kind of what's sometimes called apologetic history. That doesn't mean, oh, I'm sorry that we're Christians. That's not what it means. It means a defense of who Christians are. That's a very common thing you hear. Not everybody agrees, as usual. But so Luke Acts form a kind of history of the earliest church, although you might think of Luke as being more biographical in a certain way. But together they form a kind of history of the early church. I wish we had more of Acts, but again, that's another video. Luke, now if Luke also knew Matthew, so Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. And so that dates Luke to the time after AD 70. There are some people who argue that maybe Luke was written earlier, maybe Luke was written in the early 60s. I don't think there's any way that really is plausible at all. Especially given the fact that Luke used Mark as a source, and I date Mark to either the late 60s or the early 70s in and of itself. But another hint, and this is also persuasive to me, is the fact that if you look at the way that Luke clarifies certain specific teachings of Jesus. So in Matthew and Mark, we have a somewhat cryptic statement, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, standing where it shouldn't stand. That's kind of ambiguous. Luke gives it a message version, paraphrase. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. It sounds like Luke has paraphrased this prophecy in the light of something that's already happened, because Jerusalem being surrounded by armies is quite a clarification of the abomination that causes desolation. So anyway, most scholars, I think I'm fair to say that most experts would date Luke to the time after the temple was destroyed. And if Luke also knew Matthew, which is not at all certain, but some think that Luke knew Matthew, we're talking probably the 80s. I think that's the best bet, and I'm not strange in thinking that. I think that would be a very mainstream view to think of Luke as being in Acts as having been written in the 80s of the first century. So we're talking about 50 years after Jesus went to heaven. Now, traditionally, Luke is thought to be the author. Luke was a sometimes traveling companion of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and there are certain passages in Acts where all of a sudden he says, we did this, we did that, which you can understand why many people have taken that to indicate that it was a sometimes traveling companion of Paul. Although technically, the titles were added later. So the title, The Gospel According to Luke, that wasn't written on the very first version of Luke. At least I don't think so. And so technically Luke is anonymous. People get all angry about issues like this. What? You're saying we don't know for sure if Luke wrote Luke? But you have to check yourself and remember it doesn't say who the author is. Sometimes we get so attached to our traditions and we don't realize they're traditions. And then when someone points out, ooh, that's not as solid a belief as I thought it was, we get all upset. It just shows that our faith wasn't our faith was misplaced, basically. I'm not saying Luke didn't write Luke Acts, by the way, but just I put it in quotation marks because we don't actually know for 100% sure. It says it's written to Theophilus. You might say, is this symbolic? Because the name Theophilus means lover of God. Maybe it's written to everybody who loves God, and maybe it is. I'm not going to say that's not true. For whatever reason, I don't know why we like to think certain things, but for whatever reason, I like to think that Theophilus was a real person, and I like to think that Theophilus basically might have been kind of a rich patron that actually asked Luke to write this 2-volume series. Again, I can't prove it, and I certainly don't want to die for it, but Theophilus, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, well, let's keep going, shall we? There are some unique elements to Luke that probably should be mentioned and might show up on a test if you were taking a class on this. So, just like Matthew, Luke tells about the virginal conception. I didn't say virginal birth. Technically, there is, some people make a distinction between the virginal conception and the virginal birth. By virginal conception, we mean that Mary was a virgin when she conceived of Jesus, and in Christian circles, we also clarify that she became pregnant with Jesus without having slept with any man. She was pregnant of the Holy Spirit. The birth story of Luke focuses on shepherds and has angels. And so in keeping with the themes of Luke, Luke's birth story focuses on the lowliness of Jesus' birth. Matthew focuses on the royalness of Jesus' birth and the kingliness. You have Herod and you have wise men, you have gold and frankincense and myrrh. That's Matthew. In Luke, though, we have the lowliness. We have shepherds. We have difficulty in finding a place for them to stay and such things like that. There's a focus on women in the birth story of Luke. This is quite interesting. Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, is focused on. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is focused on. Joseph is the one that they focus on in Matthew. Anna the prophetess is mentioned. So this is one of the special themes of Luke, that there is a focus on women in the story of the way that Luke. In fact, I have a book somewhere where somebody argues that the author of Luke Acts may have been a woman. Now, I can't prove or disprove that. I have no problem with the possibility that the author of a book of the Bible might have been a woman. We just don't know for sure. Again, the tradition is that it's Luke. Luke 4 has something I like to think of as an inaugural address. You know how when a president becomes president, they give an inaugural address and they tell what they plan to do in office. So in Luke 4, Jesus takes the scroll of Isaiah 61, I believe, and he reads it. The Spirit of the Lord is on me to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, sight to the blind. This sounds like what we're going to do when we're in office. And in fact, Luke does. Not only does Luke emphasize women, but Luke emphasized Jesus' message for the poor. And so those are two kind of themes, and they go together actually, because in that world women were somewhat marginal and the poor were somewhat marginal. So Luke focuses on Jesus' mission to the marginal and indicates that that was his primary target audience, the marginal of Israel. Matthew calls them the lost sheep of Israel. Of course, Luke calls them that too. Okay, there are some unique parables in Luke that bring out some of the uniqueness of Luke. So the parable of the prodigal son only appears in Luke. The parable of the Good Samaritan only appears in Luke. Those are some of the most important, perhaps the most important parables that Jesus told from our standpoint today. The prodigal son parable shows that no matter how marginal you are, no matter how far you've gone, no matter how much you've sinned, God will bring you back, will take you back if you will come back. Parable of the Good Samaritan shows that that everyone is our neighbor, that there is nobody that we're not supposed to love or that we're allowed not to love. We have to love everybody. Everybody is our neighbor. We have to love our enemy, as Matthew says. And I think it also may show that people trump the rules, so to speak. No doubt the Levite and the priest, both of whose careers have to do with purity, were disgusted by this man who was bloody. Blood is something that is unclean, makes you unclean in Leviticus in the Old Testament. And yet Jesus says, the importance of helping this person, of being a neighbor to this person, trumps the taboos on purity kinds of things. Okay, there are some other unique parables that, again, indicate special themes of Luke. Parable of the persistent widow, where the woman keeps knocking on the judge's door. I need justice, I need justice, I need justice. Shows both Luke's emphasis on Jesus' care for women, and also another theme which we find in Luke Acts, and that is an emphasis on prayer. An emphasis on prayer is one of the themes of Luke's gospel. Luke is not very favorable toward the rich, which is interesting if Theophilus is a rich guy. But the parable of the crooked manager is downright bizarre, where a guy cheats his master, and then when he gets fired, he writes off half the debt of some of his master's debtors, people who owe him money, and basically the boss kind of smiles and says, "You're pretty shrewd." This is a bizarre parable. I think part of the overtone of this parable is the fact that money is somewhat foreign to the Jesus movement, remembering that the ancient world was more of a farming world than a money kind of world. But it all has to do with a generally negative attitude toward wealth. There's an Arab proverb from the early centuries of this millennium, of the new after Christ time, that goes something like this: every rich person is either a thief or the son of a thief. That's the general tone that wealth had in Jesus' day. And so Luke isn't very positive toward wealth, nor is James, if you read the book of James. So we have a parable of the rich man and Lazarus. This is not the same Lazarus as the Gospel of John. This is not even a historical story. It's a parable, the way it's set up in Greek. And so, again, the rich man is not viewed very positively here. The beggar Lazarus is. By the way, Luke's Gospel is, I think, the only Gospel really that makes it clear that we are conscious in between our death and the future resurrection. The rich man and Lazarus both are conscious immediately upon their death. And of course there's the thief on the cross also. Today you'll be with me in paradise. Thief on the cross is unique. The positive thief, that is unique in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, other things. Luke's resurrection stories, he completely doesn't tell us about the appearances in Galilee. For example, in Matthew 28, the Great Commission is actually in Galilee. It's not in Jerusalem, a three-day journey to the north. Luke, for whatever reason, perhaps for reasons of economy, doesn't tell about any of the resurrection appearances in Galilee. Just to read Luke, we would get the impression that everything happened in and around Jerusalem. Two men on the road to Emmaus, Jesus appears to them. That story is only found in Luke. And of course, the ascension is only found in Luke, where Jesus spends 40 days with his disciples. Actually, that's in Acts. Luke doesn't even tell us that. It's interesting to compare Luke 24 with Acts 1, even. But the ascension is when Jesus goes up into the sky. Okay, unique features of the Gospel of Luke. What are the special themes of Luke? So, if you've been with me for a while, you know that Mark has some special themes, like the secrecy theme or the disciples not getting it. Matthew has some special themes: fulfillment of prophecy, the Jewishness of Jesus is, I think, something you notice in Matthew, the harshness toward the Pharisees in Matthew. What are the special themes of Luke? Well, one is that the gospel is for the whole world. If Matthew really focuses on the Jewish target audience of Jesus, Luke makes it clear that the gospel is for everyone. And if Luke did know Matthew, which is possible, Luke may wanted to balance out the tone to make it clear. So from the very beginning, Simeon, when Jesus is just a baby, Simeon says, this child will be a light for the Gentiles. And of course, Luke is the only gospel that tells about the mission of the 70, or 72, depending on which manuscripts you follow. 70 represents the world, and so again, the mission of the 70 symbolically acts out a mission for the whole world. So the gospel being for the whole world, for Gentiles. In fact, Luke, if the author of Luke Acts is Luke, he's probably a Gentile, making Luke Acts the only book of the New Testament, therefore written by a non-Jew. Jesus' care for the poor, Jesus' care for women, Jesus' care for the oppressed. We've already mentioned that. This is a special theme of the Gospel of Luke. The importance of prayer, already we've mentioned, and although we don't get a little of it, we get some hints in Luke of what will become a major theme in the book of Acts, and that is the centrality of the Holy Spirit in all the power and in all the things, the witness, the things that happen, the Holy Spirit as the greatest gift, as it were, that God could give us as His children. And then one thing that, again, will come out more clearly in the book of Acts is that Christians aren't troublemakers. Christians had a bad reputation at the time of Christ, and it's been argued before that Luke Acts tell the story in such a way as to make it clear that the problem with Christians is not the Christians. The Christians are unified by nature. The Christians are loving and sharing and law-abiding. The problem is that people don't like them, and that others, because they're jealous or because they, for whatever reason, others tend to cause trouble for Christians. And so that the Christians are ideal. Everybody should be Christian. So it's not the problem's not the Christians. The problems are those who are troubled or bothered or jealous of the Christians. So there you have it. Very quickly, this has been an overview of the Gospel of Luke.